And welcome back. Now, government has announced 8 preferred bidders to provide electricity and help mitigate the country's power supply challenges. Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe says that the first power by these bidders should be connected to the grid by August 2022. And he says that the 2,000 megawatts program is expected to create 3,800 job opportunities. Yelland is the Managing Director of EE Business Intelligence and an energy expert, and he joins us now for a little bit more discussion and perhaps some clarity on some of the questions that we may have around this. Chris, good morning. Thanks for speaking to us.
Good morning, and to your listeners.
Firstly, Chris, your reaction to yesterday's announcement of the 8 preferred bidders for emergency electricity generation?
Yes, it has finally come. It's been a long time coming, and quite ironic that Bernard Magora, the head of the IPP office, should blame the delays on the market and the bidders when the IPP office has delayed the whole process for very much longer, months and months, since the publishing of the 2019 IRP. But anyway, today we have now announced the outcome of this bidding process, and it's really quite interesting.
Very interesting, but are you satisfied with the way in which this has played out? Are you satisfied with the process of getting to those 8 preferred bidders?
No. I think it's, it has elicited a number of responses, and the least cost responses have been chosen. But to get the least cost responses to a particular tender document is not the same as getting the least cost responses to the real problem and to get the right solution to the real problem. What I'm saying is that if you word the tender document in highly restrictive terms, you're going to get the least cost responses to how you have framed the tender document. And I think the tender document has been completely wrongly framed, and I think it's going to cost South Africa dearly in the next 20 years.
How so? And when you talk about lowest cost, how much money are we actually talking about here in order to create, let's say, each of these power generating companies?
Well, in total, the minister indicated that the investment in South Africa is going to be about 43 billion rands. But of course, that is very far from the actual cost to the customer, because the customer is going to be paying fuel costs of gas to power for the next 20 years. And if you work out the fact that there is a power purchase agreement with a firm commitment for energy from gas to power from 5 o'clock in the morning till 9:30 at the night for the next 20 years at the unknown price of gas, the cost is actually staggering. I still need to do the sums, but that is the real cost. The real cost is not the capital cost to build the plant or the investment to South Africa. The real cost is the cost of the fuel. It's like when you buy a color printer. The cost of the printer is negligible compared to the cost of the ink that you're going to be procuring for the next 10 years if you're running that printer pretty hard. The cost to the ink dwarfs the capital cost completely. And I think the entire document has been incorrectly framed. Instead, we should have gone out to tender for the least cost energy, which is like the ink. The least cost energy is not gas. And we should have gone out to tender for the least cost capacity, which is the equivalent of the printer. And if you then look at the combination of the least cost energy and the least cost capacity, there are much cheaper options than three power ships that are going to be floating in the harbors of South Africa for the next 20 years, generating carbon dioxide emissions.
So, break that down to us, Chris. What exactly are we looking at in terms of the 8 latest contracts that were issued?
Well, the various contracts are different and can be grouped in different ways. And at the media briefing yesterday, they were grouped in the following ways. Firstly, There was the solutions from the company Powership, which comprises gas engines running on liquefied natural gas that is all imported. And by the way, that entire project is fully imported. The power ships, the fuel, all of it for the next 20 years. So much for local content. Really, this local content game that is played is really a load of nonsense. We see it before our eyes now. This is a zero local content option. Okay, but anyway, that's the one grouping of technologies. The other group of technologies comprises solar PV and battery energy storage. Others comprise solar PV, battery energy storage, and gas to power. Other technologies include wind and solar PV and battery storage. So there are these different groups of technologies amongst the 8 selected bidders, but the biggest by far, is the gas engines running on liquefied natural gas by the company called Powership, these so-called floating power ships, which will float in the harbor like a bunch of floaters for the next 20 years.
So, so many questions come to mind around the rationale for all of this, but I'm glad you touched on the local component to all of this, Chris, and I wrote this question down a few minutes ago, how do these 8 new entrants, how do they actually address some of the previous concerns about a just energy transition, for example? If you remember then, of course, in the previous round of bids, you had NUMSA and I think it was Transform RSA who tried to interdict the process then because their argument was that this would obviously be detrimental to the job situation in the country. So how far does this go in addressing that situation?
It doesn't go far at all in terms of addressing local content. For one, I'm just giving you one example. This 1,200 megawatts, 1,200 megawatts from these floaters. These floaters are fully imported, and the fuel is fully imported. How the minister can suggest in the media briefing that the average local content on these projects is 50% is quite beyond me, because the majority of what makes up this, this procurement is 100% imported. So it is completely beyond me that the minister can stand up in a media briefing and say that there's a 50% local content. There are other things that I found very strange. The minister stood up there and said that in the State of the Nation address, the president had required that the limit for licensing of an embedded generator was 10 megawatts. The president said no such thing at any time. So where these facts get pulled out of the air, I simply just don't know. I listened to the State of the Nation address very carefully, and the president never mentioned that he had determined that the licensing limit for embedded generation should be increased from 1 megawatt to 10 megawatts, which is what the minister said yesterday. It's simply not true.
So we are currently once again dealing with the scourge of load shedding. Now, let's just take a few steps back. April 2018, 27 IPPs, Minister then Jeff Radebe signs off on that contract.
Yes.
We were told that this was meant to stimulate about, I think it was 58,000 jobs at the time. It was meant to bring about some 2,300 megawatts of energy onto the grid. Let's take stock. Because has that happened? Because wasn't that supposed to mitigate the load shedding situation?
Look, it of course created a certain amount of job hours. In other words, construction jobs lasting for a certain number of hours, for a couple of years. That's very welcome in its own right, but that's not the same as continuous jobs. Be that as it may, in order to create jobs on a sustainable basis, you need a pipeline of projects that continues almost continuously. And that's what South Africa needs. We do not need to suddenly build renewable energy for 2 or 3 years and then stop for 7 years. You will never create local content and factories in that environment. And in fact, the factories that did open in that environment on the expectation of a pipeline of projects were sadly let down, and there was a 7-year period of no procurement during which time these factories that were set up to manufacture wind blades, to manufacture wind towers, to manufacture PV panels and inverters, they all closed down because there was no pipeline of jobs. So it's really important to create a steady pipeline of projects upon which you can build a local industry, and most important, that local industry can develop to become an export industry. It's no good just thinking that you're building a factory for the South African market. You need to build a factory that is competitive on the global market so that we can start supplying into Africa, into Asia, into other countries, using our skills, using our core competencies and competitive advantages. We need to play to our competitive advantages and not simply play in a protected local market where we are never competitive on the international market.
But just coming back to alleviating the South African plight with regard to load shedding and putting some power onto the grid, by now, all of those projects should have been online, if I'm correct, Chris. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Actually, virtually all of them are online. And if they were not online, the load shedding we would have in South Africa would be much worse than it is right now. I can assure you of that.
But why?
Because we're not buying new generation capacity fast enough to compensate for the decline of the old plant, and it's reducing availability, reducing performance, and the fact that many of these old plants are starting now to be taken off the grid because they are capped out, finished. They have to be replaced. They have to be replaced at a faster pace. The decline in the energy availability factor is happening every day, every year, and it's happening faster than the new capacity that we're bringing on to replace the declining old capacity. And therefore, as demand increases, as it is now after COVID, we run immediately into load shedding. And if the economy picks up, well, in fact, the economy can't pick up because it'll be constrained by electricity supply constraint. We should have been doing this procurement years ago. That's the problem. That is the problem.
But what I'm trying to actually basically understand here, Chris, is that if you look at what's happened in the past, say, 2 years, in terms of Eskom's energy output and also the demand for energy in South Africa, given the lockdown and the pandemic that we've experienced, how much has our energy demand increased in this country? And if we then brought this extra capacity from the independent producers online onto the grid, why are we struggling?
Can I just correct you on one thing?
Yes,
Electricity
please.
demand in South Africa in the last 10 years has not increased. It has decreased.
That's what I'm saying.
But the performance of the plants and our inability to procure a new plant has decreased even faster than the decrease in demand. That is how bad things are. Demand has declined over 10 years, and we still can't even meet declining demand with what we got because the performance of the existing fleet is declining faster than the decline in demand.
So are we being told the whole story as the South African public? Because we are told there's Kusile, there's Medupi, at great cost and great overruns to the South African taxpayer. We're told that the units are coming online there. And we still do have, by and large, even though, as you point out, at diminishing capacity, some of the older fleet. So why are we not being told the whole story?
We are not being told the whole story. The new units from Medupi and Kusile are not performing like new units. They're not helping bring the availability factor up. They are performing, these new units are performing as bad as the old units. And so the energy availability factor stays low and is declining because of the old units. So the new units are performing like old units, and the old units are getting older every year and performing like very old units. And then the availability declines. And the bottom line is Medupi and Kusile have failed to meet their intended purpose of supplying South Africa with new, reliable, so-called baseload energy. They have failed. We have been told that these units are actually, or the coal fleet is actually intermittent and unreliable. Yet on the other hand, they're told that the coal fleets are baseload that supply 24-hour continuous reliable electricity. They do not.
But what's the problem, Chris?
They provide very unreliable electricity.
But why? Because these are new build plants.
Yeah,
we do not have a shortage of coal in this country.
They have been poorly conceived and very poorly designed and very poorly executed, to the extent where they have not met the promise of reliable, continuous baseload operation. They are not dispatchable power. They are intermittent and unreliable, and Eskom has, in fact, been saying this, that their coal fleet is unreliable and intermittent. If you're listening to what the CEO, COO, everybody says about the coal fleet, that is where we are. It's because the old plant is getting older and becoming unreliable and hasn't been properly maintained in the past, and the new fleet, Medupi and Kusile, is performing like old plants.
At this astronomical cost that the taxpayer has been saddled with.
And we are seeing the cost in the price of electricity that goes up every year.
And then the CEO, Andre de Ruyter, CEO of Eskom, last year said that he feels that there is a need to actually renegotiate the prices with the independent power producers. Let's talk about that. Because even now, it seems that they are still more expensive, and we were told that this would be cheaper energy in the end.
In the end, if we continue buying every year new capacity of renewable, it will become cheaper. It will become cheaper because the technology price has come crashing down over the last 10 years. But if you buy when it is expensive and you stop building when it is cheap, it will stay expensive forever. And that's exactly what has happened. We stopped building renewable energy after we paid our school fees at the very high price. And at the time when it's now, you should be ready to use your high school fees to earn a lot of money in the future. If you suddenly stop work after you've been to university and paid all these expensive tuition fees, all you're left with is the high costs, and you don't get any of the benefits of the future costs that you can exploit, lower future costs as a result of your clever investments up front, which certainly come at a high price. But you need to now use that expensive tuition to roll out for the next 20, 30, 40 years at much lower cost because of the good things that you've learned up front.
So what just to bottom line that, what are you saying? Are you saying, therefore, that Eskom is locked into those prices and that de Ruyter is not likely to have much joy in trying to reduce the cost from those IPPs? And secondly, what does this mean in terms of these 8 new contracts that we're talking about? Will they come in at a lower cost?
Okay, so let's first of all look at the question. Is there any likelihood of renegotiating the IPP contracts that were incurred about 10 years ago now to bring the tariff rates down? There is some opportunity to refinance some of the debt by extending the contract period above 10 years and refinancing some of the debt that exists and is still being paid off. You can reduce the cost of debt and therefore reduce the tariff. However, the capital cost has already been spent 10 years ago. So there's nothing you can do to reduce what you have already spent. There is an option to reduce what we are still going to spend, and that is on the finance cost. However, if you do the sums properly, yes, you'll be able to reduce the tariff, but not very significantly, maybe by 5%. But that's not going to make a big difference on that tariff. And it's really just, you need a financial person to do the sums. There has, in fact, been one IPP that has already renegotiated the tariff down. Walkpoort, it's a solar plant, and they have renegotiated the tariff. It has come down a little bit through the refinancing of the debt, but it's not dramatic. It's hardly worth the effort.
Well, Chris, we're out of time, but I just quickly need to ask you, literally in 10 seconds, in layman's terms, these 8 new projects, what wattage will it actually replace for Eskom on the grid?
Well, this is what was announced yesterday. It was about 1,800 megawatts of new generation capacity, which is going to be useful, but it's going to come at a very high price. It's not the least cost solution, nor the best technical solution. It will help. It will help Eskom. Eskom have got there's a gap, but I don't think it's not certain not fully meeting the gap, and further procurements will follow in the next rounds of the Renewable Energy IPP program, so-called bid windows 5, 6, and 7, and going forward. But these are not short-term solutions. They will be typically 3-year solutions.
Chris, thanks so much for your time. And that was energy expert Chris Yelland talking to us about the 8 independent power producers set to be connected to the grid by August. And that